Good afternoon, everyone. We warmly welcome and thank you for joining us for today's joint lecture on the topic Pakistan's Regional Economic Integration Challenges and Opportunities. This lecture is a collaboration between the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and the High Commission of Pakistan in Singapore. Before we begin, a gentle reminder to kindly mute your microphones and to keep your videos switched off throughout the session. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guests for the evening. Our guest speaker for this joint lecture is Mr. Harun Sharif, former Minister of State and Chairman Board of Investment Pakistan. Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS, and former Comptroller and Auditor General of India, will chair the session. We would also like to take a moment to specially thank the distinguished excellencies and dignitaries who have joined us in the audience for today's event. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via this chat to the chairperson. The questions will be consolidated for the guest speaker to answer. I now invite the chairperson, Mr. Rai, to begin the proceedings. Mr. Rai, please.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you, guests, and thank you, our chief guest. Welcome to this. And I have the pleasure to welcome onto this seminar today Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of Pakistan to Singapore, Madam Rukhsana Afzal. Thank you for joining us today. Today's event is Mr. Harun Sharif explaining to us the massive Chinese economic development project, which is referred to as the One Belt, One Road, which involves China spending a huge amount of money over the several decades on infrastructure investments in about 60 countries. The goal is to recreate the old Silk Road, which flourished during the Han Dynasty in China. The ancient Silk Road connected China with the Middle East, Africa, and Europe using caravan routes through Central and South Asia. When completed, this new Silk Road initiative will link China to Europe and Asia, Africa, using roads, railways, airports, fiber optic connections, and seaports. One of the most important countries in this initiative is Pakistan. Pakistan borders China's Xinjiang province in the north. It therefore provides China with a potential corridor through the Karakoram Highway to the seaport at Gwadar in Balochistan on the Indian Ocean. The Pakistan part of the larger project is referred to as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is normally called the CEPEC. China plans to spend at least about $50 billion on infrastructure developments in Pakistan. Some of the money would be loans to Pakistan, which Pakistan will be obligated to repay. We have Mr. Harun Sharif, who was Minister of State in Pakistan and was also chairing the Pakistan Board of Investment. He has tremendous experience in this area, and our chief guest for the day today will explain to us how this regional cooperation and its integration has taken place. So without spending more time, Mr. Sharif, may I pass it on to you? The stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vinod Rai, for a very generous and kind introduction and setting the stage. High Commissioner Rukhsana Afzal, without her, all the efforts, this webinar was not possible. So I'm grateful to her. Also to Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, for taking the initiative to discuss something which is happening in South Asia and changing, the economic, political, cultural landscape. So with this, I would like to divide my talk today in 3-4 areas. I'll start with setting the stage, introduction, then talk a bit about Belt and Road Initiative and China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But more main focus of discussion of today actually will be that this transition, how can actually it improve the lives of millions of people, and this connectivity, how to leverage this connectivity into real human development and South Asia managing to catch with the levels of East Asia in a fast-track manner. So there are challenges and there are opportunities which I would like to highlight for the debate today. So as a start, we are witnessing an extraordinary transition in the region. I deliberately use the word extraordinary because it has changed the whole way of looking at South Asia. So what I look at is there is a new economic geography emerging. We saw the past 30 years, 25 years of globalization, but now I'm very clearly seeing that physical proximity being used as an economic advantage to come up with some regional economic groupings. And that is the sentiment behind Belt and Road Initiative. Proximity is such a powerful thing, and particularly in countries where we have very large population base, so there are bigger markets and how they converge. So this whole philosophy behind this connectivity comes from this argument that we need to use our neighboring proximity to the advantage of economic and also strategic gains. So it's a north-south corridor, which I'll be focusing, as mentioned by the chair, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is one of the 6 corridors of Belt and Road Initiatives. And it is the second largest in terms of investment and one of the priority in the region. I would also like to mention, for centuries, countries have used economic, partnerships as a tool of diplomacy, also as a tool to enhance influence, the sphere of influence. It could be in shape of aid, it could be in the shape of trade, it could be in shape of, infrastructure development. The difference which I see these days is, and I just recently looked at numbers done by Aid Data in Washington, DC, a research think tank, that the overseas development assistance of China in the BRI countries and as a whole has actually doubled the amount of what US does as overseas development assistance. The second difference is that, this overseas development assistance, which is coming in multiple instruments of grants and loans and, equity investments, it is translating into physical assets mostly, rather than just, using it as a tool to influence public policy. So I want to distinguish the nature of engagement under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which we have been experiencing. So what it has led to is that the powers be have started thinking very seriously that it is time that, for instance, the region in South Asia, particularly in Pakistan, which has looked at relationships with the neighbors with the lens of geostrategic focus or conflict, resolution focus, to move it to geo-economic focus. Now, that message has been given consistently by Pakistan's Prime Minister when I was, with him, to all the neighboring and international countries. Pakistan's Foreign Minister actually speaks a lot about, economic diplomacy as a tool for future. Having said that, in the proceedings of today, I will highlight that, this transition entails very serious reforms which countries have to undertake, because for years, the mindsets, the training, the tools of engagement have been more on the geostrategic side, not necessarily on geo-economic side. So this is the fundamental change which I want to highlight. But the interesting part is that language is again changing. If we go back to the history, as Mr. Vinod Roy mentioned, that, the whole, the market mechanism and linkages in the old Silk Route are in a way, being revived in modern manner. Now, can we do it? Will it actually yield the real results which we aspire to reach to? And these are the things which I think the serious public policy makers and researchers and diplomats need to, speak more and more and find, progressive solutions of this changing paradigm from security-led to economic-led. I also see changes, in the Middle Eastern region linked to that, and recent change in Afghanistan, and I'll comment on that, the abrupt withdrawal of, US-led forces. So basically, the space is now, in a way, fed up of conflict, but they are struggling to find ways towards stability and economic growth and the shared prosperity, as President Xi Jinping, speaks about. So with this backdrop, I will have a very quick comment on the current status of China-Pakistan economic corridor. I was very fortunate to be the lead minister from Pakistan to lead the industrial cooperation part of the corridor. In fact, I signed the MOU with China 2 years back, that after done the initial infrastructure projects of 18 to 22 billion, which we called early harvest projects, which were purely focused on transport connectivity, Western China, Pakistan, all the way to southern port of Gwadar and Karachi. But also it had invested in energy sector projects because Pakistan was short of electricity supply, and that was really increasing our cost of doing business. It has been criticized that these quick projects, the cost of these projects is resulting into expensive electricity, but one can see its impact in the longer run. At least Pakistan got enough energy to deal with. Second part of this 18 to $22 billion worth of investment, which have already been made out of the 60 billion package of the first phase, which is to be completed by 2030. I think the very clear signals are now showing that how it is resulting into enhanced trade between China and Pakistan. For instance, I was looking at numbers of last quarter. So Pakistan's export to China increased by 70%, as compared to the last year because of connectivity and because of close, ties. But the challenge which I want to highlight here is that China is a huge market. When we look at industrial cooperation, there are two things which Pakistan needs to learn very carefully. Number one is that nature of ownership structure of industry in China is primarily still state-led, whereas Pakistan's industry is primarily in financial markets are private sector-led. So there is a different way of looking at things in private and public sector, and we need to understand the culture of dealing much better. Also, the size of Chinese enterprise is so large that, looking at a joint venture proposition, this marriage is not a marriage of equals. So there is a fear that a large, like Tata's in India or somebody, they come and they actually take you over. Why should they get into a joint venture? So we are looking at models of engagement with China and the private sector, particularly post-COVID, as most of the people cannot travel. So I think the best way forward for industrial cooperation is building, workable economic zones and partnerships where Pakistani managerial and labor force can actively help, build and develop enterprise. So there is a change of thinking between China and Pakistan taking place, rather than the traditional Chinese model where they basically come up with a centralized, planned and workforce, package, which looks at setting up industries in a country. So these are a few things. So there are some good news on the trade front, but Pakistan's exportable surpluses need to be doubled if we need to tap the Chinese and the regional market in next 5 to 10 years. Because Pakistan is a large country, large population, our consumption needs are very high. So if we need to export, we need not only to increase production, particularly in agriculture and industry, but also, the productivity and quality of exportable things to be competitive. So that will gain the real benefits. At this point in time, we have been exporting very traditional things like textiles and few others to our traditional partners like US and EU and Japan. But if with this new market opening up, the first challenge I see is that Pakistan will have to increase its GDP on consistent levels. It has to improve the production base. I give you an example. Currently, Pakistan's textile industry, which is 60% of our exports, it is working on 100% capacity. So if an industry is working on 100% capacity and exporting, obviously you can't export more than that. So you need to double the capacity, and that is where technology transfer and foreign direct investment play a role. So the country is ripe for, an expansion. Now, will that expansion only come from China partnership, or will other countries also jump in? So I would like to highlight that as a policy, Pakistan's Prime Minister and colleagues and Foreign Office, so we have communicated to Asian countries that CPEC investments are open to the regional partners, so that the more stakes come in, China alone, frankly speaking, might not be able to do it. Now, this whole plan actually is open up to Middle East countries, sovereign wealth funds, and I have advised them to reach it to financial markets like Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong as well to look at that. So that is where China-Pakistan economic corridor stands. Basic infrastructure has been done. And now leveraging the private capital for industrial partnerships, enhancement of productivity, and also some relocation of Chinese industry to Pakistan is being talked about. So that is where is the next 3 to 5 years I see where it's going. Now, coming to challenges. Now, this all, picture on one hand, it gives you lots of optimism, investment is coming, partnership is being, now it is visibly well positioned. And, we look forward to a brighter shared, economic future with the region. But what do we need to do internally? For years, as I mentioned, that Pakistan's bureaucracy has not seen this kind of change. Our training, for instance, frankly speaking, I must confess, our understanding of Asian countries is much lower as compared to the Western countries who have been our traditional partners. People like myself and others, all of us are educated and worked in the West and come back to this country. Not necessarily. So first and the foremost challenge for Pakistan, and where I must confess there is a struggle, and the High Commissioner will endorse me later on in the discussion, is that how can Pakistan create an incentive structure and a training structure for its bureaucracy to be more open towards this change and support a pro-growth policy implementation. Because for years and years, they have looked inward. They are only aware of their own industrial problems. Now they have to deal with a much, much bigger, client who is trying to come in. There are dispute resolution issues, there are property rights issues, there are financing issues, and how to do, structured deals, commercial deals. Bureaucracy is not necessarily geared for that, including our diplomats, because they need to speak the language of the investors now, not the language of the geopolitics. So I think that is where investments need to go. And I see as a major challenge in terms of timely completion of this transition towards economic diplomacy and prosperity. Second challenge is that how do you mainstream the role of private sector in this game? Because as I said, that the two countries have different dynamics of ownership structure. So private sector in Pakistan, they have a fear of unknown, that, you're dealing with a much bigger partner, but also, by training, they are trained to export or just deal with few markets in the past. Now, so they have to be now trained to deal with multiple partners rather than banking on few markets, which countries have been doing several years. So this is a change not only in private sector, I think in diplomacy as well. The deal in future is that, we'll have to deal with multiple centers of economic powers rather than just either or, two superpowers or, one or two powers. And that is where the struggle would be, because the dynamics of engagement in the past haven't been set in these, terms. So that I see as a second challenge, that how do you mainstream private sector and also, link it with dealing with multiple, countries with different needs and value chains. Third, and the most important, and where, places like, this Institute of South Asian Studies can play a role, is the knowledge production and management. As I mentioned before, frankly speaking, we have very little understanding of how Asian countries are doing, what are their priorities, what are the business cultures, how to engage with them. So that is where, and China, huge level of understanding. Both countries need to understand the business environment, the cultural aspects, the language aspects. So I think that is where genuine research and dialogue needs to be initiated in independent professional spaces to have these transactions more informed, but also suggest corrections, because there are media is attacking, this whole dynamic with the issues of climate change, with the issues of expensive loans. But the question is, the answers have to be digged by ourselves, and that has to be evidence-based. And you put it on table at this point in time in terms of capacity to get into a serious, meaningful dialogue on these issues. States don't have it, because states are struggling to, more in a reactive manner in South Asia, rather than investing in knowledge corridors. So I have been urging China and other Asian countries to work together and produce knowledge, which can be helpful to make this meaningful to everybody. It's very nice to actually give statements of, even bringing more neighbors into the game, but one needs to invest a huge amount of research that how to engage. Otherwise, it can politically backfire in future. The fourth, challenge which I would like to highlight is a cross-cutting bigger challenge, which Pakistan has been struggling for several years. What has happened is that country has been in the grip of, dealing with multiple, conflict issues internally, as well as in the neighborhood. There have been tensions with India, there have been destabilization in Afghanistan, and, the proxy wars in the region hasn't really let the country focus on serious economic growth policy. And now the time has come and they are thinking, but capacity is very weak. So the structure of Pakistan's economy hasn't gone through a change in line with the global trends. So we are still stuck with a very traditional manufacturing base. We are still stuck with, basic agriculture with little value addition. Only services sector has, picked up. So almost 50%, 55% of GDP is services now, whereas agriculture and large-scale industry remains the remaining half. So there is a massive, massive need to change the structures toward knowledge economy, high value addition, coming into regional value chains, and looking at basically the future of jobs, because there are almost 1 million new people coming every year, young people in the labor market. And to cater to that, one needs to look at the skill set, the way Singapore did in 70s, that you moved from the productivity-based skill set to knowledge-based skill sets. So Pakistan needs to look at that, what kind of skill mix are needed to make these connectivity and markets opening, beneficial, not for ourselves, but for the region. I will just give you some numbers. Pakistan is now already connected with Western China. Let's assume a positive scenario that, some stability and peace in 5 to 10 years comes in Afghanistan. So Central Asia all the way to Middle East will be connected to this corridor. Okay. Now, the numbers which I look at, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Western China, we are actually looking at 600 million people market, which will be connected. Now, nobody can ignore this market. But the question is that how do you actually gain from this market? And that is where critical investments in technology and human resources will play a role. And I see that a challenge of a country which has struggled with fiscal issues, which I'm coming to my next challenge. Because for years, because of the structure of economy hasn't changed, population has gone up. And, it is more becoming a consumption-led growth model in Pakistan, where we import more and export less. So the gap of, twin deficits, both on the budget side, pushes us again to go to IMF every 3-4 years. Now, the question here is that there are only two answers. One is that we need to double the exports, and that's where this China partnership can play a role. But we need to bring in far more technology transfer and foreign direct investment in order to replace the, because we are dependent on oil and other essential imports, to have enough dollars to deal with it. Our foreign remittances have gone up, but that's not, I don't see it as a sustainable means of dealing with this transition. So we need to invest in foreign direct investment, and we need to invest in basically technology transfer and export promotion in the coming years to actually reap. Otherwise, we need 7% GDP growth sustained over 5 to 10 years to actually absorb this pressure of a labor force, which I've mentioned, coming into the labor market every year. And it's very young. Pakistan's population, 50% of the population is very young. It is below the age of 30, 35. So we need to invest in, capabilities. Now, from these are the economic challenges and institutional challenges I've highlighted. There are a couple of things in terms of geopolitics which can actually go either way, because geopolitics remains in a flux in the region. Although all the countries, in fact, Afghanistan's finance minister is coming today to talk about these, but this abrupt withdrawal of, the coalition from Afghanistan has left the country cash-starved. Now, we have a cash-starved country on our Western neighborhood, which is struggling to, deal with the potential humanitarian crisis. Because even if they get money, they don't have the capacity and delivery systems to deliver it to people, because traditionally it was the multilateral systems and aid agencies doing it. All of them have left. So there's a big gap, not only financial, but also the delivery systems, how to deliver money. Maybe in the medium term, the answer will come that neighboring countries get together and help Afghanistan. But there is an imminent, risk to investors who are watching very carefully which way, the country goes. So the risk perception of Pakistan is linked to Afghanistan because we can't change our neighbors. So that is where, I wanted to highlight the geopolitical risk in a country where 90% population lives below the poverty levels. So there is a risk of, potential radicalization again, and I don't rule it out. So one needs to look at it very carefully. Now, stability in Afghanistan is directly linked to timely completion and, implementation of connectivity infrastructure. Because if states' attention goes more towards security again, so, there will be lesser resources available to complete these projects under the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So it is in the interest of the region, it is in the interest of Pakistan and Afghanistan to have stability. And if in the positive scenario we get into a stable Afghanistan, then it will open up the market of landlocked Central Asia all the way to be connected to this side. Second risk I see at the macro level is the rising tensions between China and the US. And that is where, because as I indicated in the beginning, that countries will have to learn to deal with multiple now players. So how do we balance that, one superpower which has been a partner for years and years, and now suddenly we have massive inflows coming from the emerging superpower. So to balance that act, I think will not only need higher skills of diplomacy, but also we need to work on some kind of economic partnerships which are beneficial for all. And that capacity at the moment needs to be built. Third, obviously, our ongoing issue for any long-term investor is the continued volatility in tensions between India and Pakistan. Because there are two nuclear power neighbors, if they are not, even on diplomatic talking terms formally, I think that is a point for worry, not only for investors, but also the huge population of the region. Because I understand the, dynamics and complexities of relationship, but at least the signal to the world needs to go of some responsible neighborhood practices. Otherwise, this whole dream of South Asia catching up with East Asia will remain hostage to this tension. So these are some geopolitical factors, I think, which will play a major role. But I genuinely see now that, SAARC, for instance, so far the cooperation agreements between countries were foreign policy led. I do see now a gap emerging of, institutions of coordination coming up, which are economics led. That if you start looking at diplomacy from the lens of economics, and economics does not become a byproduct of, global geostrategy or your own, strategy, it's a huge difference of the way you approach things. It might be the case as the more and more stakes I see coming from, rich sovereign wealth funds and countries of oil producing countries who have been investing in the West in real estate post-COVID, they have burnt their fingers. They are looking at emerging markets in the neighborhood. They are investing in India, Bangladesh, and when Pakistan, if these investments go up, maybe these blocks will start talking in economic terms because it will make imminent sense of proximity for that. We might not be able to solve, this whole dialogue bilaterally for a variety of reasons, but I think when the regional, sub-regional markets emerge, so I do see some hope, in that sense. Now, so these were the challenges which I wanted to highlight. Despite these challenges, the good part is that, the move and momentum towards regional connectivity is happening. Pakistan is already connected to Afghanistan, connected to India, and now connected to China. And if we have connections through Afghanistan to Central Asia, this Southwest Asia and Western China will be connected markets. And connectivity will obviously, increase the movement of people. And it is markets at the end of the day are people. So when people move and meet each other and talk to each other, I think the cultural and other aspects would help sustain this whole transition. Now, I'm not too sure that that can be done by 2030 because of the factors I have highlighted. That's the ambition. But it might, I think for policymakers, the biggest challenge is that how not only to fast track, but put a solid foundation based on mutual trust. At the moment, the trust levels, and that trust can only come from transparent, independent knowledge production. I would highlight again that we need to invest in knowledge to not only understand this transition, but also help this transition to be people-friendly. In the end, I would like to leave, on a positive note. I think the medium-term outlook, which I see already, and I've been privy to talking to, certain heads of state in the Middle East and others, I do see, tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and others somewhat neutralizing in medium term. Qatar is already back in the mainstream, which was, not the case a few years back. Afghanistan is the key question that, country will not obviously grow. It doesn't have the endowment at the moment, but at least can the neighbors help Afghanistan stabilize enough that people have confidence that trucks passing through Afghanistan have the security, or the electricity lines coming or gas coming from, Central Asia is secure. Now, that is a challenge. If we overcome, I think a major shift will happen because it will create jobs for Afghanistan and others. I have already advised Afghanistan and Pakistan to have setting up regional economic zones where Afghan people can also work, Central Asian can also work. Unless you work together on a transaction of common interest, that is something in diplomacy, in economic diplomacy is fundamental. Traditional diplomacy opens up space. I think what China has taught us is that you put a transaction on table and then structure a dialogue around it. So suddenly your short-term political interests start, converging. That's a different way of dealing with countries. Rather than just opening space and waiting for somebody to take advantage, you actually go with a deal. So that is where I think the future transactions will move towards. And the markets, and I've been fortunate to have met Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and others. Everybody is looking at a 5 to 10 year horizon when at least you have the physical connectivity and an understanding of transactions. Then the surplus capital, I think, from East Asia and others will get attracted to this particular market. Finally, I think, as I mentioned before, that the more and more people, when they come in and the capital investments from multiple countries come in South Asia, that will force South Asia to think a bit differently, because you just don't like to or would like to jeopardize investors' interest in very large populated countries where we need to look at food security, we need to look at prosperity of young population, and we need to give, if the next century is Asian century, do we want to deal with it with the lens of conflict, or do we want to deal with it with the lens of responsibility and economic partnerships? Now, that is a question which all of us need to work very carefully. There will be bubbles of excellence, there will be tensions, but I think at the end of the day, people will matter. And that is where my whole, effort of my engagement even today and, in the past has been that infrastructure alone will not bring that prosperity. It will be the institutional shifts, investments in human resources, and leveraging private capital in a meaningful manner, which will actually give us results. Otherwise, the brick and mortar alone is a temporary phenomenon of a job creation. It's not really sustainable in the longer run. So that's where I would say not really crossroads. I would say that it is a transition, and the struggle to deal with transition is nothing but natural. Having said that, the policy shifts need to come in to actually reap the benefit, not for yourselves, but tomorrow, why not on the eastern western side of Pakistan as well, where we can get into the value chains and join the levels of Asian century. Thank you very much. I look forward to a meaningful conversation ahead.
Arun Saab, delightful, absolutely delightful. That's an excellent exposition of the issues before us. And you have been very candid, you have been very insightful, and you've explained in very clear terms about what are the assets, what are the challenges, and how we need to take it forward. And I totally agree with you when you talk about the paradigm shift that is involved, because to bring about stable, long-term, sustainable economic development, stability in the area, in the region is absolutely essential. And the challenges that have been thrown up with Afghanistan, the way it has unfolded before us, is a very serious challenge that each one of us in the South Asian subcontinent will have to face to. And I think you very rightly said when you talked about the bureaucracy getting accustomed to doing business in the way that it needs to be done going forward. We face the same issues because in the sense that the administration today or the bureaucrats today are not regulators as much as they need to become facilitators. And I think that's where we are all working towards. We have some very interesting questions which have come forward, and you will enjoy answering them. The first one, which I thought we need to address, is to ensure that this regional integration, regional cooperation is sustainable over a long period of time, because that's exactly where it is addressed. What is the financial model that has been worked out to ensure? See, this has to be economically viable. Any country investing and any country into which that investment is going has to, as you agreed, has to repay back also. So there must have been an economic model, economic viability model, which has been worked out to ensure that the investment is taken care of and paid for. Would you like to address that?
Thank you very much. I think that is a fundamental question which not only is being discussed in media, but also in the policy circles. When I look at this connectivity, there's 18 to $22 billion of early harvest projects.
Mm-hmm.
So I see the financial model of different instruments. So, like the Gwadar port building is mostly done on a grant-based thing by China because they have the lease now. It used to be with Singapore, now it is with China. The power plants actually are commercially totally oriented. And Pakistan's independent power production, guarantees to me are a bit unfortunate, not to China, it is to everybody. Whoever comes in, the state guarantees a return. So I think that particular policy has hurt us in terms of a circular debt, because even if the energy is not needed, we pay the capacity payments on a state guarantee. So in future financial interaction on China-Pakistan economic corridor, I strongly urge, particularly industrial cooperation, that in the model, there should be no state guarantees. There should be a risk taken on the market and the reward should be, equivalent. I see in future, I'm not talking about the past, I know it's a combination. I think the overall cost of debt from China is slightly higher than the multilateral, but it is cheaper than the market. Okay. It is the restructuring and the tenor of the debt where flexibility would be needed. But now going forward, I very clearly see the role of commercial financial markets much higher. Because even in China, at this point in time, post-COVID, there is a need for, I don't think the taxpayers' money will be coming anymore to the volumes which Pakistan was expecting, or the grants. In fact, grants are dying globally, because of the pressures. So I see the commercial banking coming into a play, the investment banking, and the markets for the industrial cooperation and economic zones, which is already happening. But that is where the risk return will be adjusted to the nature of the project. And the government should not, and there's a very clear thinking in Pakistan, that it must not give any guarantees to any investor, because they should facilitate them to take the risk and resolve their issues rather than guaranteeing a return. So that's the financial direction of the model of connectivity which I'm seeing. And I already can cite there are 18 joint ventures between China and Pakistan, right from auto manufacturing to textiles and others, which are already in place and functioning, and which are purely on private sector commercial terms.
That's an excellent model, because I would sincerely believe that time has come when we should not, or corporates or organizations should not rely upon sovereign guarantees. Absolutely. They should be able to take debt based on the strength of their own balance sheets. And I think that's exactly what you have just mentioned about, that will be a wonderful model if it works in the long run, because that is ultimately the model which will be long-term sustainable. You talked about increasing exports and increasing, wanting to increase cost efficiency so that your exports, which are already, say, textiles at 100% capacity. There's a very interesting question which has come, which says, how does Pakistan view the prospect of using bilateral FTAs with countries as a tool to strengthen its regional integration prospects?
I'll quote the example which I dealt with directly, which was our FTA with China. I go back to the capacity question. Negotiating these FTAs need a lot of skills and experience. And normally, I spent, several years with the World Bank Group and others. So when we used to negotiate with developing countries, we will have a team of macroeconomists, PhDs, trade economists. But when we would deal with our counterparts, so there was nothing of that sort. That is where, the countries like China and the bigger countries have managed to get FTAs, which were mostly favoring their goods being sent to other countries. So we renegotiated with China. It took us about 6 to 8 months, and 313 items were then negotiated to open up to their market. And that has actually led to this increase in Pakistan's exports to China, because otherwise the balance of trade was heavily tilted towards China. Now, Pakistan needs to look at bilateral investment treaties and FTAs very carefully, and that's where the bureaucratic capacity needs to go up. But the interesting thing, and in a lighter tone, for instance, I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Jack Ma several years back. So when I spoke to him that what can we sell it to you, and that links to which I said on the knowledge investment. He said, all I know is that Pakistan, produces wonderful mangoes. But then he said that looking at the size of my market, can you export 1 billion mangoes? So, the scale is very high. So our exportable surpluses, even if we renegotiate FTAs, our exportable surpluses have to match the volumes which are required and the quality. And that is where I think the future investments, if it goes towards export-led growth, it will, combined with FTA negotiation, will help Pakistan. But in the longer run, I think it will be the competitiveness of the product, not necessarily these concessions. So that is where we need to move.
Exactly. The cost efficiency, the competitiveness of the project is the one which will help us. We have another question which talks about Western economies which are working into a value chain model of non-China supply. I mean, over the last 2 years, 2.5 years, this issue has started. How can Pakistan tap into that opportunity? I mean, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, all of them are trying to tap into that kind of an opportunity. And how can Pakistan bring the idea where China-Pakistan partnership could increase Pakistan's industrial footprint and serve the global market?
This is a question which I have worked on. And frankly, I don't have concrete answers, but I'll try to make an attempt. I think what West has learned after this recent COVID-19 shock, that relying on one particular market is not necessarily a great idea, because the sourcing of major products in the US were dependent, the consumer products were dependent on China. So when the disruption happened, so markets had suffered. Now, a lot of companies tried to come towards Pakistan, but as I mentioned, that in textiles, at least we could reach from 60% to 100% capacity, but the requirement is much higher, of the Western value chains. Now, that is where I think the dialogue with EU and others need to start. And China needs to figure out very clearly that what kind of industry needs to be relocated, which is beneficial for increasing the exports of both countries to the third countries. In the Belt and Road Initiative, initially China had looked at reaching out, tapping the Pakistan market because it's a large market, But now the time has come to start think about the getting into value chains of Western producers through technology transfer of China. Labor force in China is getting expensive. And again, on a lighter tone, I had the opportunity with the Prime Minister meeting the chairman of Huawei in Beijing. And Prime Minister asked him that, would you like to, assemble or manufacture some of the, mobile phones or technology in Pakistan, which can be exported. So he laughed. He said, in five years, if you can give me 100 quality PhD in mathematics, who have studied in Russia and France, because in future, I would only need 7 to 8 people to manufacture all that. It will be all artificial intelligence. Now, so we need to, that is where I link that the kind of structures industry would be looking for, to export to third countries. Now, the key question for countries like Pakistan is that if your manufacturing is going towards artificial intelligence and technology-based models, so how would you adjust this huge burden of population in the labor force? So the whole model of skills and linking it to industry needs to be think through very carefully to deal with this question of productivity, technology transfer, and export to value chains in the West. But I think the value chains in the West are keenly looking at this point in time. But unless the risk perception of the region improves, they might not make direct investments to the tune which one would have liked. China understands these value chains very well, and because they have been major supplier of goods, and that is where they can help Pakistan come up with products. And I can give you example of sports goods. So all the Adidas tracksuit shoes and sportswear is gradually moving towards a city called Sialkot to Pakistan. From Vietnams of this world where the cost is getting expensive. But we need to keep investing in the human resources to bring more of such things, chains in Pakistan.
No, this is where the benefit to the common man will accrue, isn't it? Because the corollary of this question is whether Chinese firms currently serving the Western market could start their manufacturing activity in Pakistan. That's what you're mentioning. So this is again, but your basic strength is that of textiles. So when these things are moving away from the Vietnams or maybe even Bangladesh into China, into Pakistan, that will be a very happy development. Because now, one more question is, does Pakistan have any domestic factors that will allow the state to continue investments with China without potentially failing into a debt trap or risk aligning entirely with one superpower? You have kind of talked about the other model, but this is talking about directly the state getting involved into what it would be a risk mitigation exercise to ensure that the sovereign does not have a liability towards the loans coming from China.
I think this question has been raised time and again, and recently Pakistan have paid a substantial amount in return to the guaranteed power projects as well, which has been highlighted in media. My submission is as follows. Looking at the size of China and looking at the size of Chinese debt to Pakistan, it's not really very large. The projects of less than $20 billion. It is up to Pakistan how we negotiate or restructure that debt if we come under pressure the way we are now. Okay. But a future model, as I said before, on state guarantees is not necessarily on the cards. Now, what I worry as an economist is that Pakistan's debt to GDP ratio has gone extremely high. It is around 80% plus. Again and again, there are only two solutions. Number one solution is that we start replacing debt with FDI, the foreign direct investment. Also, we mobilize the local financial markets rather than borrowing money from international financial institutions and putting into health and education, So we need to actually start raising more internal resources, not borrowing from the IFIs. And the third is the only sustainable solution is actually doubling the exports. And if Bangladesh could do that from the cotton actually going from Pakistan, so why can't Pakistan do it in our own country? But for that, the investment required will have to be generated from multiple sources. And there is interesting point is that because of the informal nature of economy in our countries, I see a lot of liquidity in the market, but converting that liquidity into productive capital is the challenge for state. Because money is lying around, markets continue to function, but making it, directing it where it is needed, that is where the incentive structure has to come up. I don't think China can come and do it for Pakistan. It is a Pakistan's responsibility to come up with a value proposition, which is attractive not only to China, but other countries as well. So we should not be distinguishing between, investor A or B. Whoever comes up with a good value proposition, but for that, we need to improve investment climate. And what I said again and again, that we need to invest in the quality of human resource to enhance productivity. That will attract Pakistan to the levels of Cambodia's and Vietnam's and others. At this point in time, we are at the mid-level or the lower mid-level products which are being exported. The more value you add, the more exports you will earn. Now, that is where one needs to go. The domestic factors, again, are twofold. Number one is a good policy environment, which is sustained over the years. Number two is that mobilizing domestic capital markets to the level where you can replicate some of the debt.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned you're an economist, but you just point out about some geopolitical issues. So this question concerns geopolitical issues, and it says strategic interests geopolitically appear to be China-Pakistan alliance on the one hand and US-India on the other. How can South Asia avoid falling in line with this potential adversarial straitjacket, which may not be in anyone's interest in the long term? And it's a very genuine question because, again, the issue of stability in the region to ensure that economic development takes place in the long term. Please.
I think that's the fundamental question which I hinted towards, that the tensions between the US and China has direct impact on, this whole paradigm of connectivity. And with India aligning more with the US and Pakistan aligning with China, the tensions are rising. What I see the answer to that is, and I'll be very honest, in my experience, perhaps China was not ready for this kind of pressure coming, particularly from the softer side, which is media, and English-speaking media, English-writing media, because they challenge the whole structure of BRI in a very aggressive manner. Mm-hmm. Now China has two answers. One, which they are doing, like now they are becoming a little bit reactive to that as well. Previously they were not that aggressive on these things. But I think the answer to that is I support the only, President Xi's, if you look at his recent policy addresses to Communist Party, and I can share like some of the interactions I have had with the Chinese leadership. I think the message is very clear to us that continue dealing with your territorial disputes that might take hundreds of years, but insulate the opportunity of economics to the level you can, so that at least the markets, China and India trade is actually happening. The Taiwan and China trade is, not really affected to the degree of tensions. But the question is that if blocks start emerging, and then I think there will be a gap, And when both blocs have reached a level of equilibrium, then perhaps the dialogue would be multilateral, not bilateral between India and Pakistan, which will be a shame because in terms of proximity, these are the two countries which are best aligned to gain from each other.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, now that positions have been taken on the political front to a level that no investor would actually take a risk right away, because the capital is the most coward thing in the world. They take signals from, our political elite. So unless and until Pakistan and India start talking responsibly on the economic front, I don't see a major, Now, up to the US, this whole thing, I see an India and the Eastern connectivity bloc emerging very clearly. Similarly, Pakistan, West Asia, Western China, Central Asia, and perhaps part of Middle East in next 5 to 10 years. And as the stakes go high, then perhaps the bilateral tensions, I can hope they are overtaken by multilateral stakes in the region. Because bilaterally we have, I must confess, that we have failed so far to resolve those issues, unfortunately.
Yes, and that's in the long-term interest of all the South Asian nations, that this kind of stability brings. Tell me one thing, since you talked about the organizations borrowing by themselves, what is the corporate bond market well developed as yet? And are people able to borrow on the strength of by issuing corporate bonds, and there's a market for it?
Pakistan's capital market is actually pretty robust. And term finance certificates, corporate bonds, Islamic sukuks, a number of issues are already traded and raised. The problem is in the state structure because of the budget deficits, state starts borrowing from the banking system.
Crowding out.
They crowd out the market. So unlike India, Pakistan's banking system is 80% privatized. So the private capital, if I'm a banker, it's very easy for me to just park my money in state and go and play golf.
True.
So the risk appetite of banking sector and capital market can only be increased when state stops borrowing from them. And that is one structural issue which Pakistan needs to deal with. But at the same time, the market is well developed, and some people might not know that now the majority shareholder of Pakistan Stock Exchange is China, actually. So they have actually, taken managerial control of that. Pakistani experts are managing it. I think that the intention is very clear to develop the capital markets in future so that tax reliance on taxpayers' money goes down and the market starts financing this connectivity in future.
This is basically seeking an information. Another question which says, does Pakistan have an agency like Singapore has the EDB, TDB, or more popularly known, Japan's MITI, or Malaysia's FIDA, or Thailand's BOI? Does Pakistan have an agency like, or people on board to chart the industrialization and economic development of the nation, that kind of a thing?
Well, this idea perhaps cost me my job. So, because at the moment there is a fragmented institutional structure dealing with investment and economic issues, okay? So what I wanted to do was I wanted to club a lot of things in one house and give them, authority and power to deal with it. And that was something, bureaucrats jealously guard their turf and don't let go, their positions, and that changes a major reform to, I cited the trends to foreign minister and prime minister and others that, in Japan, they had MITI. Most of countries are clubbing their trade industry ministries with foreign offices because, if you are doing economic diplomacy, then economics need to, club in with foreign office very closely. But the Board of Investment in Pakistan at this point in time does not have the muscle to actually lead this coordinating effort. And that is where policy reforms are needed. But for China, the solution have been sought by setting up a China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Authority. So a legislation is passed where they can fast track the Chinese investments. So I can actually, share the frustration of our ambassadors because they have to deal with multiple agencies and also investors. And that is a reform which Pakistan must do. I've been writing about it, advocating about it, that nobody looks at your internal federation structure or provinces. They just want to deal with one authorized agency. And that is where I think we need to move if we really want to have the confidence of the investors back.
But the CPAC that you talked to, authority that you talked about, is it a single window clearance, empowered to give clearances to projects?
Under the law, yes, it has recently been formed. And hopefully, if they do well on the CPAC projects, a board of investment and this authority, actually, I have proposed that it should be merged so that they can offer the same things to others. And frankly speaking, with no disrespect to my bureaucratic friends, the more offices we create, the more jobs we create for them. So what we need to do is that once you do consolidation, there is a fear of job losses as well, and that gets translated into resistance to that. So I think we should merge these and have, one or two things in that area.
No, I won't disagree with you there, because as a bureaucrat, we've been self-serving for the last 40 years. So how can I disagree with you? Every authority, every organization created is seen as certain jobs being created. But it will be a learning experience. If you succeed on the CPAC authority, that model can serve as a model which can help the other side to grow. There is another question which has come, which says, could you possibly discuss a little on how Pakistan is engaging with China's digital Silk Road, given Pakistan's growing digital economy? What are some of the challenges on this front?
If we look at the longer term plan of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, so it had the infrastructure, early harvest, industrial cooperation, and then the digital Silk Road partnership. Okay. With that, the investments from in fiber optics and others are being done, but that's infrastructure. What Pakistan needs to do is that we produce around 26,000 IT graduates a year. Out of that, perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 are of the quality which are globally competitive. So if we need to fast track this side, we need to invest in IT universities a lot more. That's number one. Number two is, very recently, Pakistan has, done a legislation on Science and Technology Zones Authority. And that authority is mandated to actually build, several technology parks. But again, the focus is on infrastructure. Unless and until we invest in the human resource of IT and double and triple it, actual benefit of knowledge economy will not be realized to the level which one would have liked. So I think, and Pakistan's, by the way, universities, most universities are now operating in private space. So it's the private schools which are delivering, quality graduates. So I think if an incentive structure comes up, to set up more and more technology universities and schools, that will be the answer to this digital Silk Road, because China can rely on, at the moment, an engineer of IT in Pakistan costs 3 times less than a Chinese engineer. Okay.
Oh.
So there is, and also to the Indian, because in India, the salaries have gone up. So I think there's a market which Pakistan is ready to tap. And by the way, the IT exports of Pakistan doubled this year. So there is a focus on that, but we need to get into scale.
This is a very interesting question. Let's see how you address it. It says, is the recent Evergrande crisis expected to impact Pakistan-China partnership and the CPAC?
Pardon me, which crisis?
The Evergrande.
Well, I really don't know how to answer this question. But I think any, external shock has its own dynamics. But frankly, I'm not really qualified to answer that in detail.
That's why I said it is an issue which has multifarious kind of paradigms to it, and I think it. How is the progress on the ground of the infrastructure projects which are being laid out? Do you see progress? Because I'm talking from purely the COVID point of view. How has it impacted? Has there been any slowdown? Has it, how has it progressed? Because delays is cost, and cost escalations can make all the difference between a project becoming fruitful or otherwise.
There are 3-4 things that's the real issue.
Mm-hmm.
A, the policy dimension within China post-COVID is not that outward looking for the time being, because they need to, ensure that their economy grows on sustainable basis internally. There is a fear of travel, particularly once you are connected, people from all countries will be coming to China. So I think the border controls have been tightened. What it means for Pakistan, it means 2-3 things. Number one is that the expertise from China is not coming to Pakistan to the level it was coming before, the people.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, Pakistanis traveling to China has really gone down. Flights have been reduced and everything. So the model of engagement, that's what I'm trying to say, is moving toward joint ventures, where Pakistani workforce takes charge of implementation. But this transition have slowed down implementation of some rail tracks and other things. Mm-hmm. And unless Pakistan invests heavily with China into skills development to the level which Chinese would like, I think the pace of infrastructure will remain slower than anticipated. Okay. Having said that, that opens up the opportunity for Pakistani private sector to raise the game. Mm-hmm. And show that, we can deliver managerially and workforce wise, rather than, Chinese companies giving half of the staff from Chinese side. That would be, I think, the solution in medium term, because even if COVID is, goes down to the desired levels, I think the fear of a health emergency will not go away from the minds of the nations. And there will be controls of travel in future. It will not be that straightforward. So overall connectivity. So there's a post-COVID scenario of adjustment which BRI countries are going through. In some of the smaller countries where economies were badly hurt, there were imminent defaults as well, because there was no economic progress against the investments. Pakistan has dealt with COVID reasonably well, but our growth level remains in the range of 4 to 4.5%, which is a V-shaped recovery. But as I said, with the population we have, it needs to be around 7% on several sustainable, basis years. If we do that, that would need soft side investments to increase productivity. But post-COVID scenario, yes, it has slowed down. There are project delays, there are cost escalations, but that's where I said that the costs are not that high in terms of China, and loans can be restructured.
Yeah, because that is an issue that we are struggling with also, because post-COVID recovery, as you said, V-shaped, and we have really no option, considering again our issue of population, the population size, the number of mouths to feed, the livelihood issues that we face with, that we must make this gradient of the V very sharp to ensure that stability, economic growth, development takes place quickly, as it's a genuine problem for the entire region. I have a very interesting question, which is not directly related to what you've just discussed, regional cooperation, South Asia. But considering your experience and which has been global, and you are still engaged in that, I'm asking this. Could China play the same role in South Asia integration as the US played in Europe integration?
Well, as a student of regional economic cooperation, one country with economic muscle takes the lead. If you look at ASEAN, at that time it was Japan, which took the lead of economic market integration. Here, China has very clearly taken the leadership role towards that direction. But their model is not necessarily, Europe did go through, a reconstruction phase. But then there were a number of things which Europeans themselves did to leverage on that. That's what I'm hinting towards, that just expecting China to understand, being a centralized controlled economy, to understand cultural and institutional and political differences in various countries, I think it's a bit too much. So the value proposition investments are to be done by countries themselves and come up with meaningful negotiations to actually gain the way Europe did and others did. And the US played a very major role in Europe. They couldn't play that role in NAFTA, for instance.
Yes.
So one needs to learn from these regional cooperation models. But here now China is playing the role where infrastructure is the entry point. But it has lots of public policy and softer side issues, which one needs to deal in, particularly in very populous and complex, economies with cultural differences in the region. Asia is, fascinating in terms of cultural, differences and the regional differences.
Part of this corridor, the CPEC, are a fiber optic network. There is solar parks are being talked about. There is a talk about a corridor where trains will be traveling at 160 kilometers. These are all issues which the entire region is interested in. In fact, India is working towards those kind of developments also. How has it been able to take off? Because that will be a huge learning experience for the entire region.
Well, fiber optics, as I said, the investments are being made. But you must realize that even within China, although on the mobile technology, they are fairly advanced, but on the internet side, it's a little bit of a controlled environment. In terms of railway connectivity, Pakistan has signed this something called ML1, which will connect from Karachi to Peshawar to all the way up to China. But as I said, such a huge $8 billion undertaking, now with post-COVID, it will take some time. But you have raised a very interesting question, because if we look at future of Afghanistan, it has three endowments. Number one, it is its location to connect Central Asia. That is something they can leverage on if things stabilize. But one of the major endowment which they have, up to $3 trillion, which people say, is the minerals. And mineral development cannot happen without locomotive connectivity. So it fits in China's natural competence to look at, this railway connectivity from a commercial lens for future extractive industries. So I do see, because that's where they have a comparative advantage. They are very good at that. And they have the economic muscle. I think, but that is where the Pakistan, India, and the regional countries need to play a role. If the investors get, a sense of stability, then this locomotive connectivity will be fast-tracked. At this point in time, it has been done on the regional basis, not in a holistic manner.
There's another question which says, could you throw some light on the environment for venture capitalists to look into the startup industry in Pakistan? Of course, not directly related to what you've mentioned, but it is, I think, a genuine concern for a lot. And with Pakistan still in the FATF gray list, how is it affecting the confidence of venture capitalists? And of course, ease of doing business in the country, because Pakistan has gone up in the ranking for the ease of doing business. So how's it been?
Gee, I am partner in crime, so it was under my ministry and leadership where we got 30 odd points, ease of business increase. But this World Bank index, being a former, World Bank regional advisor as well, they are very standardized instruments. They are not necessarily country specific. Countries have different requirements on ease of doing business rather than these standardized things which bank asks for. Now, my answer to 3 questions. FATF, I'll start with. It is very unfortunate that multilateral global institutions have been politicized. Because FATF traditionally is a technical body. Its job is to assess the countries and give remedies. But if you start getting into political press conferences and other things, then the confidence of people on these multilaterals go down. So I have been urging the international community that, the multilateral system, the IMF, the FATF, there needs to be seen by the world giving solutions, not necessarily becoming something which can be politically, linked. So frankly speaking, at this point in time, the politics in FATF is very high. And Pakistan is working, towards all the reforms. Whenever we do, they still keep us in the gray list. So that I won't go into detail because I know this very deeper. I have dealt with FATF in various levels. But my request is that it's a technical body. It should actually advise the countries to get out of, these issues rather than going to media and making public statements by the people. Now, venture capitalism. Now, the need for Pakistan startups have basically shown a very strong growth in the past 3 years. In fact, they have grown 10 times more than where they were. The risk capital gap remains because Pakistan's financial market is largely commercial banking led. So we have the regulation, and there is something called UN has started Finance for Development. We have the, wherewithal, but if you, in a country which struggles with current account issues and volatility in currency, for a hard currency based venture capitalist, that risk remains high of the hedging of your foreign exchange. But there is a huge demand for local currency venture capital in Pakistan. If somebody wants to come into those things, Pakistan would really welcome. At the moment, we have small venture capitalists, $50 million, $25 million, but the demand is much, much higher than that. And they are, particularly startups which are selling their products abroad, they don't have the currency hedging issue. So they are raising hundreds of millions of dollars from venture capitalists outside.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So you got to understand, if a startup is focusing on local market, they have the FX volatility issue. But if a startup is actually, serving an international IT market, that's not an issue for them. So yes, there is a market for international venture capitalists, but looking at startups which are export oriented.
So as a consequence of the CPAC, as a consequence of the development that is taking around the CPAC or the industries that are coming in, are there a large number of downstream industries which have got a fillip, which have gotten an engagement, and some of these startups which can feed into them? Has that kind of a second level development started taking place? Because that is the stage which will provide employment to ancillary industries.
It is happening, and people like Alibaba have come up with their financial houses here, like Ant Financing, and others have moved to Pakistan. And they are buying, these fintechs and others, to reach out to marginalized areas. But to answer your question, I think there are structural things which Pakistan has to address. At the moment, as I said, that crowding out of financial sector is a binding constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Similarly, by privatizing all banks, with the exception of few, the banking sector has shrunk to urban areas, because the state's objective of equity obviously doesn't hold in private sector. So there is a need now to create, a developing financing instruments with the objective to generate these, downstream industries. So this new finance minister has started something called Kamyab Pakistan program, where he wants to shift the credit towards these industries by 20 times more than where it is. But my answer is that credit alone is not helpful unless it is matched with the delivery of skills needed to manage that credit, And for that, financial markets must have an outreach to these people. And because of COVID and the private nature of institutions, that has shrunk. So that's a mismatch Pakistan has to deal with.
Okay. I think we'll take a last question, which says that with the Chinese deep involvement with Pakistan and investments in Pakistan, do you think other countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore are shying away or reluctant of investing in Pakistan?
I think Pakistan, initially what has happened is that there was a lot of investment, particularly in the auto sector, came from Japan. But for Japan, over the past 10, 15 years, they also became somewhat inward looking. And the space was open and China took it, frankly speaking. Now, Japan will have to reposition in the market with very big competition from China to come into electronics and their areas of strength. Korea, interestingly, is making inroads again. And they are competing with Chinese in Pakistan. We see lots of, Samsung being now assembling their telephones in Pakistan. They have just announced. 3 Korean, 2 major cars, Kia and Hyundai, they have moved to Pakistan. So they are giving competition because in some of the things they have superior technology than China. So Korea is making a comeback, whereas Japan at the moment has shrunk in terms of their, presence in the markets in Pakistan. But again, the muscle of China is big. I think Pakistan's strategically, it will be nicer to have multiple players coming in the game because there's always a risk dealing with one big partner. And that is where I think the future, this money lying down in Middle Eastern countries, this is more of, the investment money, not necessarily the industrial development money, So that has to come from East Asia, the Indonesia, the Korea, the Japans, and hopefully one day from India. So this is something, the Pakistan should move towards in 5 to 10 years.
Harun Saab, I really wish, number one, we had more time, but more importantly, I wish this had been a face-to-face kind of a discussion when we would all have been in a hall. And because I think the way you have approached the issue, the candor with which you have applied yourself to it, we would have loved to have sat down over a dinner table or a coffee table and discussed this forward, because it is something which holds great interest for the entire South Asian region. And you have been very correct in pointing out that unless we have stability, and that stability seems to have been disturbed by what has happened in Afghanistan. None of us had control over it. What has happened in Afghanistan, which has affected all the other countries in some way. And the fastest, the earliest that can be settled, I think will impact each one of us. So thank you very much for this delightful exposition. You've talked about models of engagement. You've talked about private sector engaging itself, which is so appropriate and so relevant to the entire region. And you've talked of development of the knowledge economy. But most importantly, which appeals to me, the ease of doing business, which was, of course, your forte, and the fact that the bureaucracy now has to reposition itself and become a facilitator to ensure that all the efforts for development are really reaching the ground and bring about the fruits of it all. So thank you very much for this lovely exposition. It has been delightful. We all enjoyed it. And I know that any number of people would have loved to engage with you over what I would call the tea or coffee sessions to continue this dialogue further. But I will now pass you on to Divya, our MC for this evening. But thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope some point of time in Singapore, we can get to discuss this and take it forward.
No, I look forward, and thank you for giving me this space and doing a wonderful, mediation in the whole session. I look forward to more engagements, and let's hope physically, in future.
All yours, Divya.
Thank you, Mr. Sharif and Mr. Rai. With this, we have now come to the end of this joint lecture. We thank you for your participation and hope to see you again at future ISAS events. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my special thanks to Pakistan High Commission for organizing it. And I look forward to more interactions.
Rukhsana, Madam, Excellency, I really look forward to seeing you sometime when we can meet in Singapore. It was such a pleasure.
Same here, really. I really look forward to more physical events here in Singapore so we can host Harun Sharif Saab and of course you, Vinod ji. It was really excellent, captivating talk. And thanks a lot to all the audience who we invited and they came up, they attended. I hope they enjoyed it as much as I did. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harun Saab. Thank you so much.
Many thanks indeed. We look forward to staying engaged.
Inshallah, inshallah. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
All the very best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.